Welcome to the National Fantasy Pregame Show, brought to you by Nolan Ryan Beef Jerky, the official beef jerky of Major League Clubhouse Managers, available at Kroger's and Amazon.com. Also brought to you by Fantistics, InsideOfFootball.com, as well as MyFantasyFix.com. That's where you find myself and Michael Waldo. You also find us on SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio at various times. Hi, Michael. How you doing?
Hey, Lou. I'm doing really well.
Week 6. Time to make some money, right? We need to get going here.
That's right.
Although I'm not doing too bad this year.
Yeah, no, it's been a really good week, or a really good year so far. I think we've been on, I think we've been on a lot of the right plays. It's just a matter of how you construct your lineups. I was talking to a subscriber, earlier this week, and he was asking me about GPP strategy. He was telling me how he's been on all the good plays. He doesn't think it's an issue of identifying plays, and I think what he just hasn't been making money. And what I told him is that's the best situation to be in if you're a GPP player, because it means you're on the right track. Now is not the time to change your strategy or your process. What you really need to do is just continue to be consistent. And what I think we need to understand is what that means is consistent both in the way you construct your lineups and consistent in the tournaments that you play. Right. Because the last thing you want to do is change up the types of tournaments you play, and maybe you decide, well, I haven't won in 4 weeks. I'm going to not pay so much money this week. And then suddenly this is the week that you go off. And the thing about being a GPP player, or even if you're playing GPPs, what you really need to understand is you can pretty much live off the entire season off of 1 week's GPP if you hit. So just continue to be consistent. If you are on the players, if you look at the winning lineups and you say, man, I had exposure to all these guys, I just didn't put them in that same combination of a lineup together. That's a great situation to be in. Keep doing what you're doing. You eventually will hit that lineup. So,
right. That's what I was thinking that subscriber was getting to. He's hitting all the plays. He's getting all the nice plays, but they're just not showing up in the same lineup.
That's right. And it's different. We'd have a different conversation if the guy's telling me, hey, man, I'm picking these guys and I'm just getting goose eggs. I just can't seem to identify the right types of players. But he's saying, hey, I'm getting all these guys, and maybe I'm just not combining them correctly. So it's a better situation to be in. And I think just in general, too, when we talk about tournaments in football, it's significantly different than what you would do in tournaments in baseball. And I think what you need to understand is you need to take a lot less risk in football than you do in baseball to win a GPP.
Is the risk, and again, we talked about this in the quarterback podcast in terms of rating the 3 positions that we divide them into for the podcast, quarterbacks and running backs, and then wide receivers and tight ends. And we were talking with the quarterbacks on how would you rank them in terms of matchups, and you thought we play matchups a lot with the quarterbacks. My question is here, in terms of taking the risk, it seems to me in GPP, rank the positions as we describe them. Which one is the one you're willing to take the most risk on? It has to be the wide receiver position, doesn't it?
So here's what I'll say to that. The wide receiver position is the most important position to get right. So the way you do it is I like to take 2 wide receivers who I think are going to score a ton of points and pair them with a risky wide receiver. Mm-hmm. Pair them with the guy who only gets a handful of targets that could go off with a huge day, because the last thing you want to do is take a safe wide receiver and then take 2 risky wide receivers, because already that first wide receiver has a lot of risk and maybe he won't turn out and hit on that given day. You add in a second player who's just like him, the probability of both of those guys hitting on the same lineup is very, very low. So the way I like to do it is you have to get the wide receivers right to win a GPP. That's the only position that I think you actually have to nail correctly. So I like to hit the 2 guys that I think are the best plays, and then go down to that, the Ted Ginn Jr. type of play, who's the home run hitter, who could get you over 100 yards and a score.
All right, I think we talked about it in the quarterback podcast as well. And head on over to the National Fantasy Pregame Show Facebook page, the quarterback podcast, running back podcast. This one, the wide receivers and tight end podcast, will be up as well as Burrows and football by the time the main slate kicks off on Sunday. That's probably up on Saturday. And I think you talked about having 4 core players that you like to build around in tournaments. Of those 4 core players, how often are wide receivers half of them, 2 of them?
Frequently, very frequently. Rarely, I would say rarely do I have 2 running backs that are my quote-unquote core. Yeah. I like to mix and match my running backs quite often. Usually there's
how often would 3 receivers be? of that core four?
Um, Rare as
Yeah.
well. I think typically my core typically consists of three guys more than four, and if it is four, sometimes it'll be a tight end. A
Hmm.
lot of times it'll be a tight end, quite frankly, because usually the tight end position is one that I don't get a wide exposure to just from pricing standpoint or guys that I just don't like the matchups of.
Right.
When we're talking tight ends, I think there's enough defenses that you want to exploit tight ends on that typically I just pick out the cheap tight end against a defense that gives up a ton of points to tight ends and I just roll with them. So typically what it kind of looks like of a core is usually a running back, two wide receivers, and a tight end. Or if there's not a week where I feel good about a tight end, it might just be a running back and two wide receivers. But that's typically the makeup of the core for me.
All right, while we're here, let's talk about tournament play and GPP play. Who do you like this week at the wide receiver position?
Listen, when you're talking wide receivers, you always want to target the guys who, keep in mind, this is my GPP target, not my safe end options. When we're talking about the guys who we want to score a ton of points, you want the guys who run a ton of deep passes or deep routes, and you want the guys who, a large percentage of their current yardage is off of deep plays, because that's a pretty good indication that they're going to see those deep balls moving forward.
Right.
And there's a bunch of guys who really fit that category. But, this week we're talking about Stephon Diggs, Brandon Cooks, Deshaun Jackson, Will Fuller, Jaron Brown, Martavis Bryant, T.Y. Hilton, and Adam Thielen. All those guys are in spots this week in matchups I like, and they're all guys who get a ton of yardage via the deep ball. So those are the types of tournament plays that I'm going to pair with safer end options like an Antonio Brown, like a DeAndre Hopkins, like a Michael Thomas. The safer guys who I want to bank the points with. Then you take those GPP flyers on those guys who run those deep routes with the hope that, hey, my safer guys are going to hit, and then hopefully one of these other wide receivers will also hit to then propel my lineup up, especially if then the rest of my core hits as well.
Those guys, the Brandon Cooks of the world, they can make it on one play. They can make a day on one play.
Yeah, absolutely. You love it in the first quarter when your guy gets a big play.
That's right.
You're just sitting pretty all day.
Money in the bank. Let's mix up instead of going wide receiver and tight end separately, we're in tournaments. Let's stay in the tournaments, tight end tournament plays.
Yeah, it's tight end. Again, this is a situation where you just want to look at who are the tight ends going up against defenses that struggle in defending. And one of the worst defenses at defending tight ends is Washington. And this week we get George Kittle. Had a big week last week. I saw 9 targets, caught 7 passes. And he was utilized around the goal line too, which I like to see. So this week he's really, really cheap going against a bad defense. George Kittle is going to be my tournament play. I'm not expecting him to be low owned. I think he's going to get quite a bit of attention for that reason, but I don't care. I just want to save that money at tight end so I can pay up at wide receiver and running back. So he's probably my primary option. I think Cameron Brate is another guy who could see a good day. Going up against Arizona. Arizona hasn't been great against tight ends. They rank 15th, so they're kind of middle of the pack. But Brate has been kind of the crutch for Jameis Winston all year long. He's got touchdowns in 3 straight games, and he's seen a pretty healthy dose of targets in this offense as well. So he's a pretty safe play. I think Brate is probably cash game or tournament viable.
All right, cash games for wide receivers, and how's the construction of the wide receiver grouping a little bit different in cash games than it might be in tournaments? You talked in tournaments about getting two wide receivers with a good floor and then go for a big hitter.
Yeah, so cash game lineup construction, you want to just go more balanced. You want to just make sure you get that floor established. So if you have the money to go 1 big guy and 2 mid-tier, fine. I'm even okay kind of going 3 of the middle tier. However you want to do it, it's fine. It's really dependent, I think, in cash games of format as well. I think on DraftKings, you can get away with taking a receiver who doesn't see a lot of looks around the red zone as long as he sees a lot of targets in the middle of the field. So a guy like Jarvis Landry is always a play on DraftKings because he has such a high volume that his PPR value is pretty high. He establishes a nice floor for you. If he gets a touchdown, that's just icing on the cake. But on FanDuel, you lean a little bit more on those touchdown dependent players. Chris Hogan is a guy who has been a touchdown machine for Tom Brady. He's been looking to him. He's a guy who on FanDuel I prefer a little bit more than I do on DraftKings. But I think the guy really on both sites that is a tremendous value is Devontae Adams. We're going to see Xavier Rhodes likely covering Jordy Nelson, assuming Nelson is back this week and playing. What that leaves is Trey Waynes to cover Devontae Adams, and we saw Devontae just absolutely beat Aaron Rodgers' primary target on that final drive against the Cowboys last week. He was targeting him right and left. He targeted him in the end zone for that final catch. He got that touchdown pass. He saw 11 targets, 2 touchdowns. I think this is going to be another big Devontae Adams week. He's only $5,800 on DraftKings. He's a little bit more expensive on FanDuel at $7,200, but I think that safety is a nice way to get exposure to that Green Bay offense. So in cash games this week, I like getting some exposure to Green Bay's wide receivers. I like getting some exposure to New England's wide receivers, whether that's Cooks, Hogan, or Amendola. And then I think you can mix and match. I think another nice value play is Adam Thielen from Minnesota. Stephon Diggs has been getting all the glory, but Thielen's been a very consistent player. He's seen exactly 8 targets each of the last 3 weeks. He probably doesn't have that same type of ceiling that Stephon Diggs, but like I mentioned, if you look at the total percentage of Thielen's yards, he's actually got a larger percentage of deep passes than Stephon Diggs even does. So I like Thielen. I think the matchup lends itself quite well. He's going up against Morgan Burnett, who really has struggled to defend slot receivers this year. I mean, look at last week with Cole Beasley. So I think Thielen is a nice value play on both sites. Both sites have him in the $6,000 range.
And again, at the tight end position, there's little distinction between a tournament play and a cash game play. But is there a cash game guy that sticks out here?
I think the way you get distinction is you pay up. Maybe you find a way to get Gronkowski, and maybe you find a way to get Travis Kelce if he's cleared from concussion protocol. Jordan Reed's cheaper this week, but he's still battling an injury. If you believe, what the coaching staff has had to say, they want to get him more involved. So maybe you go with Jordan Reed. So I think that's how maybe you get some differentiation in tournaments. One guy I didn't mention in cash games, I think Austin Seferian-Jenkins is a great cash game play this week. Mm-hmm. We know the Patriots give up a ton of yardage, and Seferian-Jenkins has really established himself as one of the 2, if not the lead receiving option for Josh McCown. So I think Seferian-Jenkins is also a nice value play as well.
And before we leave wide receivers and tight ends, we talked in the quarterback podcast. You can find that on the National Fantasy Pregame Show Facebook page, as well as the running back podcast as well for Week 6 and Bros in Football Week 6. We talked about Cam Newton as a cash play against Philadelphia and Carson Palmer against Tampa Bay, 2 teams that everybody's throwing against. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and that brought up the question of stacks. So talk a little bit about stacks this week, how it plays on cash games and tournament games.
Yeah, so, what I like to do is target the offenses that have stackable offenses. So a team like the Patriots, it's hard to stack because you don't exactly know where those targets are going to go.
Right.
One of the offerings that we offer on the premium side of My Fantasy Fix is the target market share and the red zone market share. And what that really, I think, is useful for is when you're identifying stacks, look at the offenses that have very funneled and direct distribution of their targets. So, a team that only throws to 2 or 3 different wide receivers primarily is a much more stackable team than one that spreads it out where everybody's at a 15% market share. So I think this week, if you're talking, Carson Palmer, or you're talking, Cam Newton, obviously, he has 2 primary receivers with Devin Funchess, who actually has been the more consistent receiver than Kevin Benjamin. And then you also you have a tight end option with Ed Dixon. So it's going to be those 3 guys who are going to see the targets. Yes, Christian McCaffrey's involved, but I think if you're stacking, I think I'm going to be mixing and matching probably primarily between Funchess and Dixon.
Yeah, so I was thinking McCaffrey when we were talking about Carolina. Yeah. So, but you like...
Well, that's how you can differentiate too, right? Because people are going to be afraid to stack a running back with a wide receiver or stack a running back with a quarterback. By doing so, you're going to get natural contrarian plays that way as well. So it's kind of like that idea where when you're doing a Pittsburgh stack, you go Big Ben, you go Le'Veon Bell, and you go Antonio Brown because you have a pretty good feel that those are the guys who are going to get the scoring. The Panthers aren't to that extent. I don't think I feel as strongly that all the scoring is going to flow through Christian McCaffrey and Devin Funchess and Cam Newton.
I don't know if Funchess has that level. I don't know if Funchess has that level of consistency yet to really lean on that heavily.
Yeah, so I think that's the big difference there between that type of stack and not. I think it's very rare to see a running back wide receiver stack that works as well as a Pittsburgh stack does anytime they're at home.
Okay, this is the Wide Receiver Tight End Podcast for Week 6. Head on over to the National Fantasy Pregame Show Facebook page. There's a quarterback podcast and a running back podcast, and Phil Backett, Chris Chion with Bros in Football. Week 6, we may also have some surprises for you as well. You want to check it out and give us a like on the National Fantasy Pregame Show. Go get yourself some Nolan Ryan beef jerky. It's the official beef jerky of the Major League Clubhouse Managers at Amazon and at Kroger's if you have a Kroger's near you. Head on over to Fantistics and InsideOfFootball.com. Help out with your season-long fantasy team. Get that thing up and running and, win one of those. That takes this thing out of a loss on your DFS, doesn't it, Michael?
Oh, yeah.
Winning your season long? Yeah, absolutely. And head on over to myfantasyfix.com, newly redesigned. You're going to find some free content over there, plenty of free content to help you out. You'll also find our podcasts from the National Fantasy Pregame Show as well. Check that out. There are single-week subscriptions if you want to try it out. And myfantasyfix.com is where you want to go. National Fantasy Pregame Show, all the podcasts will be up on the site. Go check it out. Give us a like so you know when we're posting stuff. And we'll see you all next time.